In this video, I will teach you how to play the Vienna Gambit, and this can lead to extremely good positions for white, like the one you are seeing right now. So I will teach you how to play this opening in 4 simple steps. So we are going to start with the first step, and that is basically the main line, the most played variations by grandmasters at least. So we are going to play pawn to e4, black plays pawn to e5, and we play our knight to c3, the Vienna. The Vienna Gambit is an opening I suggest using only if your opponent plays their knight to f6, which is the most commonly played move. So if they play this, we play pawn to f4, and that is the Vienna Gambit. And it's a gambit, of course, because we are giving away this pawn temporarily. White can take this, and in the future, after we move this pawn, we will be able to recapture this. Online, most players will capture this pawn. Over the board, if they have studied this, they might not capture this, because capturing this leads to a lot of trouble for black, as you can see in my Vienna Gambit accepted video. Here we are going to focus on what if black doesn't capture your pawn, which can also lead to some very interesting positions. I'm going to start off with the most played line by grandmasters, which is pawn to d5. That's our first variation. And I have to say, in this position, only 16% of players play this. And I want to show this first, because this is the best variation for black. All of the other options for black are really terrible, and you will get a really easy game. But against this, it's important to know what to do if you want to play this. So against this, pretty interesting position, because black, of course, ignores the fact that we are attacking this pawn, and instead they try to go for a counterattack. So we are just going to take this. It's just free for now, and we can also attack the knight. So the knight has to move, and almost everybody will, of course, move the knight here, because this also captures a pawn, and now material is equal again. You might also get some players which push, but that's really not so good for black, because of takes, and basically black has to do something about this, because of course if they take here, you can basically promote to a queen, and yeah, it doesn't really matter. Even though they can also go for a queen, of course we can always capture them. So that's not a good position. They have to take this, and then we can take here, and white is just up 2 pawns. So yeah, really bad position for black, but some players play this. Most of them will just capture on e4, and then we get this position. And right here there is a move which is really important that I want you to remember to play for white, and that is to play queen to f3. And the reason why is, if we make any other move, I'm seeing if I can find a move. For example, let's say we play pawn to d4, and many of these lines you are going to be hit with the queen check to your king. If you want to stop this check, you have to play the pawn here, and in some variations black can capture. And this specific line, there's actually the counterattack with knight to f3, but yeah, I wouldn't recommend going for this. I know some players actually allow this on purpose to try and punish it, but I just wouldn't allow it at all. And that is why we are going to play queen to f3. Queen to f3 can support the g3 pawn if we ever have to play it. And also, of course, now we have double pressure on the knight. So black has to do something, otherwise they are going to lose a pawn. Most of the time, that doing something means that they are going to capture here on c3. There's not much else they can try. Maybe they can try and play f5, which is a really high level move. This protects the knight as well. Then usually you can play pawn to d3, you can kick it away, you can get something like this, and still, yeah, it's not super clear in my opinion what's going to happen here for black. So most of the time they will just capture, and you can recapture. You might be thinking which pawn is best. Well, the answer is both of them are about equally good. The benefit with this one is that we can now push for the center, and we have a little bit of a better center. The benefit of using this pawn is that we also open up the bishop. So this gives us a little bit more tempo, and this gives us a little bit more central presence. So I recommend here taking with the d pawn, but you can basically take with any pawn you want. And the game might continue with something like a bishop here, or maybe knight to c6, but usually it all ends up in about the same lines. We can play our bishop out. That is why we captured with the d pawn. And we are going to be protecting this pawn, because if you take like this, of course, this pawn has now become isolated, meaning it's not protected by any other pawn. So we have to make sure it's well protected by pieces so we don't lose it, because black can always and will always attack this. And in this variation, we're actually going to castle queenside, which is something that doesn't happen a lot in the Vienna, but here it can happen. And black has a couple of options. If they know what they are doing, they are probably going to play this because they can set up a little bit of a threat here, trying to go in with the bishop and skewer the queen so they can win the rook. And of course, they can also castle queenside. If they play something like bishop here, you can also just develop. I'm seeing which is the best. Maybe bishop to d3. Actually, funny thing is bishop here can also be played if you want to go crazy. But if they castle kingside, usually they are in a lot of trouble because you will just be able to quickly start an attack. The general rule is that they have to try and start a counter attack, but yeah, it's usually going to be too slow because we will always be setting up our attack really quickly, pushing this pawn as well. Maybe they will have to play h5 to try and prevent it. We can try and bring in the knight, and this will usually end pretty badly for black. So if black knows what they are doing, they might play for this trick, which of course we can just move the queen, put some pressure, it's fine, and then they are also going to castle queenside. Knight f3, for example, h6, h4, something like this. I think if you remember the main ideas here, you will always be fine. But I wanted to show you this first because this is the most, well, not the most difficult, but it's the best option for black. So it's the one for white where you really need to know the moves. That's what I want to say. You have to know this specific variation because if you play random moves, you can get in a bit of trouble as well. Now we are going to take a look at all of the fun lines, which can result in the positions like this, which I have shown you in the beginning. So again, of course, e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, Vienna Gambit, and here black plays pawn to d6. And this is online one of the most played moves. The most played being, of course, captures, which is really bad for black. The second one being pawn to d6. This is a really beautiful game because it just demonstrates some really simple opening logic which you can use to win a pawn. So what are we going to do here? Well, we are white. We want to develop and we want to castle, and we also want to fight for the center. So the first thing we're going to do is knight f3. And here, it's not even really that you have to memorize the moves. You just have to understand the plan and you will always be fine. Most of the time, black will play knight to c6. Sometimes they can also try to go for a pin, but the pin is actually never really that good because of h3. If they capture, you can capture with the queen. We always want the queen here anyway, so that's no problem. And if they go back, all of a sudden, we have this. And if they go here, the bishop is trapped. Or they have to sacrifice the knight. Even though this might look scary to you, everything is actually fine. The knight is covering this, the rook is covering this, the queen is covering the knight. So yeah, you can play something like d3 and castle queenside in the future. And yeah, you are just up a piece basically. So yeah, bishop to g4, not such a good move. Usually you are going to get knight here to c6. And the reason why we are talking about these two moves is of course because there is some pressure in the center. If black just plays any other move, well, in some variations we might be able to go and just capture a free pawn here in the center. So black has to try and prevent this. Basically the best options are either protecting it or of course pinning one of our attackers. But protecting it is the best option. And we are simply going to play bishop to b5. And this is an easy move to remember, of course, because bishop to b5 pins the knight. And if the knight is pinned, that means we again have double pressure on the e5 pawn. So if we can eliminate this knight, we can take here in the center and we can win a piece. The most played move here is bishop d7, which is, yeah, it's not super good, but it's really hard to find anything decent for black. And the thing is, it's really recommended actually for black to at some point just take here, except that we are going to play for the center and then we can get something like this. But of course, if you see this, this is a very beautiful position for white. And if you get this, you will always be very happy. You have the center, you have 4 developed pieces, you can castle. Yeah, it's tough to lose positions like that. But black, of course, many times also doesn't want to capture and just wants to hold on. So they might try something like bishop to d7. And you might be thinking at this very moment, okay, it's time to grab the free pawn. Because I can do takes, 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 and takes. But we are forgetting something. We also have a weak pawn, which is attacked twice and only defended once. So yeah, you might run into something like this. And in the end, you didn't achieve anything and you even helped black a little bit. So we have to be a little bit patient. We don't want to immediately capture here and try to go for a win. We have to play pawn to d3 first. just because this solidifies our position. Now our center is really safe, and then now we finally have this threat that we can go and take here on e5. The best thing for black is to just capture and allow us to capture with the bishop, which is of course again really good for white. It's a little bit less amazing than the previous position, of course, because the pawn is on d3 and not on d4, but it's still pretty good. But many players will just make the mistake here of playing a6, the most played move, and this is pretty easy. Capture, capture, we can take everything, and then we can take in the center. And of course, this is perfectly safe. We are just up a pawn, and it's already tough to lose this game as well. Other moves also, sometimes you get something like bishop here, but again, you can just do a big trade and also win material. Yeah, there's actual or castling maybe. They can also, yeah, they can also castle in some variations, but it doesn't matter. We're always winning. So pretty much they have to go for this, and as I said, it's pretty good for white. You can get something like this, and then we are still going to play pawn to d4, and this is again the same setup we have seen 2 or 3 times already, just a little bit more slow because we had to move the d pawn twice. And you still might get this, pawn to a6, but of course we don't want to give away the bishop for the knight in those variations because there's no reason to. We have already achieved everything we wanted and this pawn is gone, so we are just going to move the bishop. If that's all you remember for this line, it's perfectly fine. And I think this line is really fun to play and also really easy to remember because you just have to remember the fight for this e5 pawn and you will always get a good game. Next up is something really terrible for black, which is played quite a lot, and that is of course again the Vienna Gambit, but black plays the knight to c6. And if we take a look at the database, this is the 3rd most played move, and it's played even more frequently than the really good pawn to d5, which is the best try for black to defend against or attack. Knight to c6 is very common, but of course this is a really bad move, because we can just take, the knight can recapture us, sure, but we can attack the knight, and this looks a little bit like the Halloween Gambit, if you know that opening, because we are chasing around the knights, with the benefit that we didn't have to sacrifice anything, we just got this for free. So the knight has to move, we can play pawn to e5, and if you look at this knight, and we count the possible squares, there's actually only 1 square, which is going back. And of course already, if you see this, and black just had to move back the knight, yeah, black really did something wrong here. Sometimes they might try to be sneaky, pin your pawn with the queen, it never really matters, we can just block this, and then of course this is again a threat. If they look around for a new home for the knight, they will realize they still have to go back, and yeah, we just had an in-between move, and now this queen is even blocking their potential development squares as well. So yeah, black has to go back, we can play knight f3, of course we want to defend our position a little bit as well. You would want to push in some variations, but yeah, we are just dropping a pawn, so that is why we have to play this first, so that we can then maybe push in the future, because the knight won't be able to capture here. Bishop b4 is very common, some other moves might be played as well. Let me just show you, for example, here bishop to b4, because they want to try and pin our knight, but of course we do get to push our d5 pawn, which is the entire plan, it's what I told you about. And again, the knight has to move back, we can play something like queen d4, hitting the bishop, protecting everything basically, and get something like this. And this is already completely winning for white, there is nothing black can do. And if you look at this, you might be thinking, well, the material is still equal, why is this so good for white? Well, just look at this. All of the black pieces are still pretty close to the starting squares, and the black knights, they can't even enter the position. Yeah, there's pretty much nothing. They could maybe try to push this, but again, yeah, they won't really achieve anything, and at some point we might also be able to win even more material. So it's pretty devastating. They can try other things, of course, as well. They can maybe try to play pawn to d6. We can always pin the knight, threatening to push to d5. So that's also a problem for them. You could get a variation like this. I'm just going to show you one. For example, this. And then you can sacrifice the knight. Well, actually sacrifice. It's not even a sacrifice, of course, because this is protected by the rook. But it's, yeah, there is some insane stuff in this variation. Pawn to d5 is sometimes also played. Again, you can always develop the bishop. You can castle. You can go and be aggressive with your knights. The rook is also helping here. And even if they castle, all of a sudden, there is a checkmate right here. There is actually triple pressure here on this pawn as well. How are you going to defend this as black? I don't think you can defend this. You can play h6, but we can actually sack the knight, because of course if they take with the rook, we give this check. The king has to go somewhere, and then bam, we can even take here with the bishop. It's just insane. They can move the king. We can come in with this bishop. The king has to go again, maybe this check, king has to go here, and then for example this is a checkmate. So it's just one variation, but this is all pretty damn terrible for black. And then now we are going to cover 3 final variations all in one, because they are all very similar. And that is, again, of course, we play this Vienna game, but black decides to move the bishop. And you might think that this is insane because of course they are just giving away this pawn. Well, actually, I think about 10% of games you will get an opponent who just moves the bishop. Yeah. So it doesn't really matter if they move the bishop, you're always capturing the pawn, kicking away the knight. This is already winning. If they move the bishop here to c5, it's the same story basically. You can even push d4, you can develop the knight, it's all free. A really funny line is what if they play bishop to d6, because here you actually win a piece. You take, you attack the bishop, and if you look at this, the bishop doesn't really have any squares except going back, and then we just fork the bishop and the knight, which is also of course just a free piece for us. And then the other variation, of course, if they move the bishop here, again, we can take, attack the knight. They can move the knight back, they can always do an in-between exchange, but the interesting thing is, we can play here pawn takes. The knight still has to move. They might move in here, and then we can play our queen to g4. And this is just a double attack, and this is already completely undefendable from the black side. Even if they try to hold on, block with the knight, we are going to attack the knight. They might defend the knight, we are going to attack the knight. At some point the knight has to move. We can play d5, kick the knight around, and then bam, sacrifice here, well, take here on g7, I should say. Not sacrifice, of course. And yeah, they have to play something like this. We can take with the bishop. I mean, this position doesn't really need any explaining that black is completely lost. So I really recommend, if you want to try this out, you should definitely try to play the Vienna Gambit. Watch the video on the Vienna Gambit accepted as well if you haven't already, because if you know the Vienna Gambit accepted and declined variations and you understand the basic principles, you will really be an amazing e4 player and you will win many games in beautiful fashion. I will cover more Vienna games in the future, so stay tuned for that.